some of her key findings. Shirley got her master's in public policy here and was one of the pioneers in getting enrolled simultaneously in a master's degree in public policy and the PhD in government program. A very daunting challenge that some other individuals have also undertaken. Shirley has, before working on her PhD dissertation, was a longstanding, valued staff member for Crocus, which is the center that I direct along with Deborah Phillips, is the Center for Research on Children in the United States. And when she was with Crocus, she co-authored 3 papers on the Tulsa pre-K program that appeared in Child Development, in the Economics of Education Review, and also in the Policy Studies Journal. When Shirley was with Crocus, she was the consummate team player, and we could always turn to her when we got into difficulties, which we did from time to time. And she became something of an expert on propensity score matching, on multiple imputation, and on boosted regression. So if you ever have questions about any of the above, it's good to know. So it was a bit of a surprise when Shirley started working on her dissertation that it had nothing to do with Oklahoma and nothing to do with early childhood education. But that's a good thing. Shirley carved out a topic that was of keen interest to her and that is increasingly important to our nation and to our workplaces, including the federal government, but not just the federal government, and that is work-life supports, and specifically the role of women in work-life supports in the federal government. So her dissertation really lies at the nexus between political science and public policy, and she's going to basically summarize some of the key questions and some of the key conclusions, and then we're going to ask some questions. So Shirley?
Yes, thank you. So first, I'd just like to thank everyone for being here. The people in this room have been really instrumental in making this really important day happen for me, and I'm very, very grateful to all of you, and looking forward to sharing my results with you. Before I do so, I'm going to apologize in advance because naturally I came down with a cold the week of my dissertation defense. This is a dramatic improvement over where I was a couple of days ago, but I may still be a little scratchy, so I'll do my best to avoid that. So as you can see, my dissertation is titled 3 Papers on Work-Life Supports and Gender Diversity in the Federal Government. The motivation that sort of inspired this dissertation topic is an interest that I have in a number of phenomena that characterize modern American life. One is a number of social and demographic trends which have increased the salience of work-life issues. So when I talk about work-life issues, I mean issues that are related to challenges managing work and non-work responsibilities. So traditionally, we talk about family, but other things are also relevant here. So factors that have driven an increase in the salience of these issues include an increase in women's representation in the labor force, particularly among mothers, a very large increase in single-parent families, which tend to be female-headed households. At the same time, men have really increased their involvement in the home, particularly with childcare, and feel increasing pressure to do so. Meanwhile, people have delayed childbearing and delayed marriage at the same time as we have an aging population that's going to require care for unprecedented amounts of time. What that means is more and more people are going to be simultaneously caring for the young and the elderly, and they'll be doing so for longer periods of time. The natural result of this is much higher reported levels of conflict and stress associated with managing work and non-work responsibilities. This has been true among both men and women, who actually seem to have somewhat converging levels of reported conflict. However, gender differences in paid and unpaid labor, although they've been diminishing, they still persist. So to give you a sense of what that means, today, women still perform roughly double the household labor that men perform, and long work hours still remain the province of men. And as I'll talk about in my data, to give you another sense of how true this is, among the dependent caregivers that I look at in my data, 14% of the men were primary caregivers compared to 50% of the women. So what that suggests is that work life probably has some gendered dimensions, even in the contemporary American landscape. Because of that, and because even though women are in the workplace, they have not advanced to leadership positions as quickly, occupational segregation and pay gaps persist. So when you combine those trends, this suggests the possibility that work-life practices that facilitate the combination of work and non-work responsibilities in the workplaces could potentially improve gender equality in the workplace. So this is an assumption that's often stated in scholarly research and in the popular media, but it actually hasn't been very well tested, and that's especially true in the context of the federal government. In order to address that gap in research, my dissertation addresses an overarching research question and then 3 sub-questions. So the overarching research question is, do work-life supports promote gender diversity in the federal government? The way I answer that question is by examining 3 separate dimensions of the issue in 3 different papers, which I'll summarize shortly. The first paper asks whether work-life supports are more important predictors of job satisfaction for women than men. If so, that's one possible mechanism by which work-life supports could promote gender diversity, because we know from the organizational literature that job satisfaction is associated with a wide range of other work-related outcomes, including retention, for example, performance, and advancement. The previous research in this area has begun to look at gender, but the published studies on gender in the federal government have not actually formally tested gender differences in the importance of work-life supports. In addition, those studies have generally failed to account for a really important feature of federal employee survey data, which is that employees are grouped in agencies. And from a statistical standpoint, what that means is that if you don't account for the fact that people are grouped into agencies, it can bias your results. So I both formally test for gender differences using interaction terms, and I use an approach called fixed effects, which addresses the problem of clustering within agencies. The second paper asks whether agencies with stronger work-life supports experience increased gender diversity over time. The idea here is that the extent to which work-life supports are especially important for women, whether it's through job satisfaction, which I test, or other mechanisms which I don't, then agencies that are particularly good at providing these supports, whether it's programs and policies or organizational support through managers and leaders, should see gains in gender diversity over time. This is, again, often assumed, but it actually hasn't been tested using agency-level data, to my knowledge, before. So that's one important contribution of that paper. I think that paper also makes 2 other important contributions. One is that whereas the vast majority of studies on diversity in government use proportion of women as the dependent variable, I actually use a number of different theoretically grounded and conceptually distinct measures of diversity, and as I'll discuss later, that's actually pretty consequential. In addition, all of my dependent variables measure changes over time, which is something that's not very common in the literature, and the idea there is to address the possible problems of endogeneity or causation, and while it doesn't fully resolve that problem, it moves us a step in that direction. Finally, my third paper asks, do work-life strategies help or hinder career advancement, and does that happen in a gendered way? The reason this is an important question is that even if work-life supports are successful at, say, getting women into agencies, it doesn't necessarily answer the question of whether women are also advancing. And the extent to which women are going to be able to exert influence is dependent on access to leadership positions, supervisory positions, and gender equality is also contingent on reducing widespread occupational and other forms of segregation that exists. So this is something that has been discussed somewhat in the literature, but there are no recent studies looking at this, and the data set that I used for this has actually been very little used by practitioners. So why should we care about this particular question? What's the significance of this? I argue that gender diversity and work-life both take on special significance in the context of the federal government. One reason for that is that the federal government has a pretty long history, a stated history, of a desire to be a model employer and a leader for other sectors and employment practices. That is not an uncontroversial principle, as you might imagine, but it is embedded in a number of legislative and executive initiatives, and it's certainly a very salient feature of a number of recent initiatives under the Obama administration. The extent to which the government manages to be a model employer is also related to a second issue, which is federal recruitment and retention needs. The federal government is the nation's largest employer, and it has to compete with other sectors for valued employees. We know, for example, that it's estimated that by 2017, 30% of the federal workforce will be retirement eligible. We need to attract younger workers who we know value work-life balance and workplace flexibility even more than previous generations. And the federal government also has to compete for highly skilled employees who may face, say, higher salaries in the private sector, but the federal government could potentially offer work-life supports to counter that compensatory disadvantage. In addition, what's unique about the federal government is that the contemporary civil service is guided in its practices by several principles that are actually embedded in the law. These are called merit principles. One of them is the idea that the government should ensure a civil service that is representative of all segments of society. That's the way it's worded. Now, the theory of representative bureaucracy, which comes out of public administration and political science, offers us some interesting ways to think about what that would mean, a civil service that's representative of segments of society. So this theory stems from some normative concerns about the fact that civil servants are not elected, but they're very influential, and a lot of research has shown us that that's the case. So it has been suggested by some theorists that to the extent that the bureaucracy is representative or looks like the population it serves, that can mitigate some of these concerns for at least two reasons. So one reason is that symbolically it can promote legitimacy of government institutions. The other reason is that this theory has posited the possibility that the presence of women will result in women's interests being better represented. That's a little bit harder to show empirically, but there is a growing literature that shows that's the case, and that really also shows why it's important to understand antecedents of diversity in the federal government. Before I begin, I want to take just a moment to clarify what I mean by work-life supports. Work-life is a very evolving field. It's rapidly evolving, in fact, but there is no single definition of work-life to date. So with regard to my study, when I talk about work-life supports, I mean two things. So one is programs and policies that facilitate the integration of work and non-work responsibilities. The policies and programs that I look at in this study include flexible scheduling, telework, which is just working from home, dependent care programs, which includes child care and elder care supports, employee assistance programs, which are essentially contracted services that provide a wide range of counseling referral for personal issues such as grief counseling, financial counseling, and so forth. Worksite health and wellness programs are one of the newest additions, but one of the most popular additions to the work-life portfolio. And finally, a very traditional area of work-life support is family and other forms of leave. In addition, the other element is organizational factors that facilitate the integration of work and non-work responsibilities. The work-life literature really stresses the importance of organizational culture, climate, and leadership support. It's one thing to have programs and policies on paper, but if they don't have support, then they may not yield benefits, or employees may not use them at all. We know that that often happens. So as I mentioned, my first paper examines the question of whether work-life supports are more important predictors of job satisfaction for women than men in the federal government. The data for this analysis comes from the 2012 Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. This is a representative survey of permanent federal employees. It's conducted every year by the Office of Personnel Management, and the unit of analysis for this is the individual employee. And the method that I use is called agency fixed effects regression analysis. Basically, this is just a way for me to look at predictors of job satisfaction while accounting for unobserved differences across agencies, since employees are clustered within agencies. In each regression analysis, the dependent variable is a job satisfaction index, and the key independent variables are work-life program satisfaction, which respondents who participated were able to rate on a 5-point scale, perception that supervisors are supportive of work-life balance, again, an agreement 5-point scale, and senior leadership support for work-life programs, which again, respondents rated on a 5-point scale. all of these key variables were interacted with gender in order to formally test gender